In the spring of 1931, a well digger named Elias Combe went down into a dry hole on a ridge above the Buffalo River, and the men who lowered him swear he stopped screaming before the rope went slack. They pulled him up. He was breathing. His hair had gone white. And for the rest of his life, whenever anyone mentioned the bottom of that well, Elias would say the same 6 words and nothing else. Something down there is still awake. For 100 years, the old women of the Ozarks warned people about wells. Not about falling in, not about bad water. They warned about depth itself, about a line under the ground you were never meant to cross, and about the thing that waited on the other side of it. People called these women granny witches. The county called them a nuisance, and when the last of them tried to write down everything she knew, somebody made very sure the record disappeared. Today we are going to dig it back up. Before we go down there, subscribe to the channel. Everything we cover here lives in the gap between the history you were taught and the history somebody buried, and the algorithm buries it right alongside them. Subscribing is the one thing that keeps an account like this one alive long enough to matter. So do that now, and then let's climb down into the dark together. To understand what these women were so afraid of, you have to understand the ground they were standing on. The Ozarks are not young mountains. They are among the oldest exposed rock on the entire North American continent, a worn-down plateau of limestone and dolomite that water has been eating through for longer than there have been human beings around to watch it happen. Underneath the hills lies a second landscape that nobody planned, a hidden country of caves and sinkholes and blind rivers that run in total darkness and surface again miles from where they went under. The old-timers had a saying for it. The Ozarks are hollow, they said, and the hollow parts are older than the hills. The fear ran deeper than the wells too, if you knew how to listen for it. These were people living on top of one of the most caved-out landscapes anywhere on Earth, thousands of caverns and blind passages threading the rock beneath their farms, and yet the old Ozark culture kept a strange and very specific distance from the deep ones. Shallow caves were fine, root cellars and shelters and good places to run a still. But every district had its caves that were simply never entered. Dark mouths in the hillside that the oldest families walked their children in a wide circle around, and if you were fool enough to ask why, you did not get a story about bears or bad air or a lost cousin. You got a hard change of subject and a look, and sometimes an old woman would tell you only that some doors in the ground had been left standing open a long time ago and had never once been properly shut, and that the shutting of them was not your job and was never going to be. People who study these hills have written for years about the caves the mountain folk feared and never quite worked out the pattern behind which ones they feared. The granny women knew the pattern by heart. The caves they feared were the ones that ran downward, toward the old floor. People settled these hills late, and they settled them hard. Scots-Irish families pushed up out of Appalachia in the early 1800s, looking for land that nobody else wanted, and they found it here, steep and rocky, and cut off from the rest of the country by geography that could swallow a road whole. Isolation like that does something to a culture. It preserves things. Songs and sayings and cures and fears that had been rubbed smooth everywhere else stayed sharp up in these hollows, handed down mouth to ear for 6 or 7 generations without ever once touching a printed page. Whatever these people were afraid of, they had been afraid of it for a very long time, and they had never had a reason to stop. At the centre of that spoken world stood one particular kind of woman. They called her a granny woman, or a water witch, or sometimes just the person you sent for when the doctor was 2 days' ride away and your wife had been in labour since sundown. She delivered the babies, and she laid out the dead. She knew which plants would bring a fever down and which ones would stop a heart. She could take the fire out of a burn by whispering over it, people swore, and she could find water underground with nothing but a forked branch of witch hazel and a kind of stillness that most people never learn to hold. That last skill is where our story really begins. A woman who can find water can also tell you exactly where not to dig. She walks the ground with the forked branch loose in her hands, and she feels the living veins turning far below her feet, and she knows the difference between water that moves and water that only sits. And every one of these women, spread across a territory the size of a small country, women who in many cases never met and never could have compared notes, agreed on one single rule. You have to sit for a moment with how strange that agreement really is. These were women with no schools, no journals, no meetings, no possible way of knowing what a woman 3 ridges over happened to believe, separated from one another by hard country that took days to cross on foot. By every rule of how folklore is supposed to behave, their beliefs should have drifted steadily apart across the generations, each hollow slowly growing its own private tangle of superstitions the way cut-off places always do. Instead, they held to one single shared rule with the cold precision of a written law. A granny woman down in the White River country and a granny woman up on the Missouri line, 2 women who would live and die without ever once laying eyes on each other, would hand a well digger the identical warning, down to the gesture, down to the drop in the voice, down to the exact way they both refused to point at the ground while they said it. That kind of agreement does not grow up wild on its own out of scattered mountain fear. That kind of agreement is what is left over when a single piece of knowledge, once held whole by many people, has been worn down across a very long stretch of time until only the one part that could not be allowed to die still remains. The rule survived because the rule had always been the entire point. Everything around it, the reasons and the history and the true names of things, had already crumbled away. The rule was simple, and across 100 years it never changed by a word. When you dig a well, you dig for the living water, the water that runs and turns and renews itself. You go down until you strike the vein that comes up cool and clean, and then you stop. You line the walls, you cap the mouth, and you thank the ground for what it decided to give you. But if you dig past the living water, if you keep going down out of greed or stubbornness, or because some paid surveyor told you the real vein was deeper, then sooner or later you will hit something the granny women had a dozen different names for. The dead water, the old seam, the cold that comes up to meet you. They always described it the same way, and that sameness is the first thing that should bother you. The air changes before anything else does. It goes still and heavy and cold in a way that has nothing to do with the season, a cold that somehow feels like it is paying attention to you. Then the walls of the shaft change. Men who dug too far reported striking stone that was cut, not natural rock. Worked stone, dressed and squared and fitted together, far below any depth a human being had any business putting it, as though their little hand-dug hole had broken clean through the ceiling of a room that was already ancient when the mountains above it were still young. And below the worked stone, they said, waited the water you never wanted to reach, black and perfectly still and warm as blood. The men who actually did the digging talked about it too, the ones who came close to the seam and had the sense to stop in time, and their accounts add one detail the granny women themselves rarely said out loud. It was not only the cold, it was the quiet. A hand-dug well is a noisy place to work, water trickling, the spade biting, loose dirt rattling into the bucket, your own breath loud and close in the narrow air. But the men who went down too far all described a certain point where the sound simply stopped, where the noise of their own labour seemed to be swallowed before it could ever climb back up to their ears, as though the space opening below them was quietly drinking it. One digger told a granny woman that near the bottom he had swung his spade against the stone as hard as he could manage, and heard absolutely nothing back, no ring, no thud, no echo, and that the silence had frightened him so badly he had climbed straight out and refused to take his pay. He kept his life. The ones who pushed on past that silence, who told themselves it was only their own rattled nerves and kept working down toward the black water waiting under the fitted floor, were the ones the granny women had to be sent for at a run. And by the time anyone was sent, it was very nearly always already too late. The granny women had one instruction for a man who struck that seam: fill it that same day, before dark, and never speak of where it was. The dead water was not poison, it was a lid. And something underneath it had been waiting a very long time for someone foolish enough to lift it. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the well warnings the granny women spent a century trying to keep alive the exact depth they swore you must never dig past, the words they spoke over a seam the moment they sealed it, and the county's own ledger listing every well that was filled, struck from the survey, and erased from the map, with the dates written beside them. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The woman who finally tried to write all of this down was named Delphia Rankin, and if you go looking for her in any official record, you are going to have a very hard time. That is not an accident. She was born sometime around 1,859 inches, a hollow in what is now Newton County, Arkansas, the daughter and granddaughter and great-granddaughter of granny women, stretching back into the old country. By the time she was an old woman herself, in the middle of the 1930s, she was the last living person who still held the complete body of the knowledge, not just the cures and the catching of babies. The other part, the part about the wells. Delphia had spent her life watching the world she understood get paved flat. Roads came grinding into the hills. The county sent men with brass instruments to survey land that had never once been measured. Mining companies arrived looking for lead and zinc, and they drilled and they dug, and not one of them ever thought to ask a granny woman where the living water ended and the dead water began. Delphia understood, the way old people sometimes understand things all at once, that she was the frayed end of a rope that had been unbroken for centuries, and that when she died, the rope was going to die with her. So she did the single thing her entire tradition had always forbidden. She started writing it down. What she wrote, according to the handful of people who saw the pages before they vanished, was not a diary. It was closer to a manual. Page after page of instructions for the living, all of it circling one obsession: how deep is too deep. How to know the instant you have struck the seam. What to do in the first minutes after you realize where you are. And running underneath all of it, like the black water itself, the reason, the history that nobody was ever supposed to remember. She built the manual out of incidents, because the incidents were the proof. And the first one she recorded in real detail was one that people still whispered about when she was a girl. In 1867, just after the war, a man named Ransom Petrie came up into the hills from somewhere back east with a little money and a big idea. He had heard the Ozarks were full of caves, and caves meant saltpeter, and saltpeter meant profit. So he hired local men, and he dug. He drove a shaft down along a ridgeline where no water had any business being, on a spot a granny woman had told him plainly to leave alone, and at 91 feet his diggers broke through into open space. The men who came up out of that hole said the walls of the chamber below were not stone at all, they were brick. Old brick, deep red and glazed and fitted, arched overhead into a ceiling like the inside of a cathedral, 90 feet under a mountain top in a country where nobody had ever built anything sturdier than a log cabin. Ransom Petrie went down to see it for himself. He took a lantern and a rope and 2 men to hold the line. And the account Delphia recorded, taken down decades later from one of those 2 men, says that Petrie reached the floor of that chamber, stood dead still for a long moment, and called one sentence back up the shaft. He said, "They're stacked." Then the lantern went out, and when the men hauled the rope back up into the daylight, the end of it was cut, clean through, not frayed, cut, and Ransom Petrie was never seen again by anyone, living or dead. The second incident she wrote out in full happened inside her own memory in 1889, and this time it happened to a professional who should have known better. A well contractor named Josiah Teague came up from Little Rock with a steam rig and a cable tool, the newest thing going, a machine that could pound a hole straight down through solid rock at a speed no hand digger could ever match. He took a contract to sink a deep well for a brand new settlement on a bench of land above the King's River, and the granny woman of that district, a friend of Delphia's named Pinky Sisk, walked down to the site and told him flatly to move his rig 100 yards east and to stop at 40 feet. Josiah Teague laughed in her face. He had a machine. He did not need a woman with a stick. He pounded that well down past 40 feet, and past 60, and past 80, and every one of those days Pinky Sisk stood at the edge of his camp and refused to leave. On the 9th day, at a depth his own logbook put at 104 feet, the cable went slack in the pulley. The heavy iron bit, a thing that weighed as much as a grown man, had stopped hammering against rock and started swinging free in open air. He had punched through into a space. His crew winched the tool up, and it came out of the hole dripping warm black water, and snagged on one of the flukes of the bit. Torn as though it had been ripped loose from something far larger, hung a piece of worked metal, bronze, or something close to it, gone green with an age that made no sense, and cast across its face with a row of letters in no alphabet a single man at that camp had ever seen. Pinky Sisk took one look at it, told every soul there to be gone before dark or be dead by morning, and walked home. 6 of the 8 crewmen left. Josiah Teague and the 2 who stayed behind to guard the rig were gone by sunrise, rig and all. And the only thing anyone ever found afterward was the hole which had somehow filled itself to the brim overnight with packed wet mud that not one living person had hauled there. Not every account she kept was about a grown man chasing a profit. One of the ones that troubled her most for the rest of her life was about a boy. In 1902, in a hollow over toward the Boston Mountains, a 12-year-old named Arliss Modine was lowered down an old dug well on a rope to fetch up a bucket that had come loose and dropped in, the way farm children were sent down into wells all across that country because they were small and light and would work for nothing at all. The well was believed to be dry and safe, an old one, capped for years, reopened only that spring because the family had run short of water. Arliss went down easy and quick. Halfway to the bottom he stopped calling back up to his older sister working the windlass. She called down and got no answer, and then she felt the rope in her 2 hands go strange, not heavier and not lighter, but taut in a way a boy's small weight simply does not make a rope taut, as though something down below had taken hold of the far end and was, very gently and very patiently, testing it. She screamed for her father. When the men finally hauled the rope back up into the light, Arliss was still knotted to the end of it, unharmed, eyes wide open, and completely without speech. He lived another 60 years in that same hollow, and never spoke a single word again for the rest of his life, and the family sealed that well over at the boy's own silent insistence, Arliss dragging stones to the mouth of it himself for weeks on end, until it was packed full, a mute child burying with his own hands the thing that had reached up and touched him in the dark. Delphia met him once, when he was already an old man. She wrote that he could still plainly hear whatever question you put to him. He simply would not, or could not, answer it, and that whenever anyone said the word well in front of him, his eyes would move, just once, straight down toward the floor. That was the shape of nearly every story Delphia collected. A stranger, usually. Someone who had not grown up with the rule, or who grew up with it and decided he was cleverer than it. A shaft driven deeper than it ever should have gone. A breakthrough into something that simply could not be down there, fitted brick or dressed granite or a floor of squared black stone, and then one of only 2 endings. Either the man came back up changed, aged, white-haired, silent, like Elias Combe on the Buffalo River, or he did not come back up at all. And she counted them. Across her own lifetime and the lifetimes of the women who had taught her, going back to the 1810s when the very first families reached these hills, Delphia Rankin documented what she believed were more than 40 separate breakthroughs into the old undercountry, and more than 20 human beings who went down into it and never returned. The county has no record of a single one. Of course it doesn't. You do not file a report that says a man was taken by the thing beneath the well. You write down that Ransom Petrie left the territory owing money, and you close the ledger, and you move along. Gathering these accounts was slow and painful work, and it took Delphia the better part of a lifetime. People did not want to talk. A family that had lost a man down a well did not tell that story at the supper table, and a man who had come back up white-haired and silent could not tell it at all. What Delphia had that no outsider could ever hope to have was the deep trust of the tradition itself, the earned standing of a granny woman, the plain fact that when she came asking, the hills understood she was not some curiosity seeker passing through, but the one person whose inherited job this had always been. The accounts came out in broken pieces, a detail let slip at a wake, a confession pulled from a dying grandfather, a warning a mother finally handed down to a daughter because she could feel her own time running out. Delphia gathered every last piece, and then she did the one thing not one of the grieving families had ever been able to do alone. She laid them all out side by side. And laid side by side like that, the scattered private tragedies stopped looking like tragedies at all, and started looking instead like a record, very nearly a survey, a map of one single enormous buried thing, sketched out blind across 100 years by the accidental boreholes of people who never once knew they were mapping anything at all. But Delphia noticed something the county never would have, because the county was never looking. The breakthroughs were not scattered at random, they clustered. If you took a map of the whole Ozark region and marked every single place where somebody had dug too deep and struck the worked stone, the marks did not fall across the hills like a spray of unrelated accidents. They lined up. They followed something underneath the ground, a pattern of buried structure running in long straight lines and slow, deliberate curves across dozens of miles, completely indifferent to the mountains and rivers sitting on the surface above it, as if the entire range of hills had simply been dropped down on top of a city. The clearest account she ever took, and the one she copied word for word, came from the well digger we opened with, Elias Combe. In the spring of 1931, Elias was hired to deepen a dry well on a ridge farm above the Buffalo River. The family had once had good water and then lost it, and they wanted the old shaft pushed down another 20 feet to chase it. Elias was the best deep digger in 3 counties, and he was not a superstitious man. He went down. At around 60 feet, his spade stopped ringing against rock and started ringing against something hollow. He scraped the muck away and found himself standing on a floor. Flat, fitted stone, laid in a pattern, with a seam of black water welling slowly up through a gap where 2 great stones did not quite meet. And Elias said that as he stood there in the cold that had risen to meet him, he heard something move inside that gap. Not water. Water does not sound like that. Something drew itself up against the underside of the stone, slow and enormous and deliberate, and it pressed, and one fitted stone the size of a wagon began, very gently, to lift. He screamed exactly once, and then the men at the top heard it stop, and the stopping frightened them far worse than the scream. They hauled him up limp and white, and he would not speak for 9 days. When at last he did, he told Delphia what he had felt in the dark. He said it had been waiting for the stone to move. He said it was patient in a way that only something with all the time in the world can be patient. And the very worst part, the part that whitened his hair in a single afternoon, was that when the cold came pouring up around him, he had not felt hunted, he had felt recognized. There were survivors, and Delphia paid very close attention to them, because the ones who came back had all been marked in exactly the same way. The white hair, always, sudden and total, as though the colour had been frightened straight out of them. A cold they never fully shook again, a deep ache in the bones that no fire on earth could reach, so that even in the dead heat of August they sat drawn up close to the stove. And a small set of words that they used without ever having compared notes, men from different counties and different decades who had never once met, all reaching for the same handful of syllables to describe what they had felt down there. It was awake, it was old, it knew them, and it was glad, or it was hungry, and not one of them could ever say for certain which, because down in that cold at the bottom of the world the 2 things had felt precisely the same. For most of her life Delphia Rankin knew the what without ever knowing the why. She knew the rule, she knew the incidents by heart, she knew the pattern the breakthroughs traced across the map. What she did not have was any explanation for how a buried city had ended up beneath the oldest mountains in America, sealed behind fitted stone, with something still alive and still moving in the water underneath it. She found her answer late, and it did not come from the hills at all. It came from a book she was never meant to see. Before we move on to what Delphia found inside that book, stop for a second. What you just heard about the account Elias Combe carried up out of that well is the part that changes everything. But it only truly makes sense when you see it written out next to the map of the breakthroughs, the fitted floor, the lifting stone. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The book came into Delphia's hands the way important things sometimes do in poor country, by accident and against every odd. A travelling man, a peddler or a preacher, depending on who tells the story, left it behind in a cabin where she was sitting up with a sick child, and she kept it because no one ever came back to claim it. It was old, printed somewhere across the ocean in Europe, and most of the words in it were in a language she could not read, but it had illustrations, and the illustrations stopped her cold in the lamplight because she had seen those shapes before, down in the dark, at the bottom of wells. The book showed cities, enormous cities of white stone and black iron, with towers and domes and arches shaped exactly like the ones people were pulling up out of the ground all over the world in her own lifetime and calling ancient, calling mysterious. calling the work of some vanished race that nobody could quite name. It showed forts built in the shape of perfect stars, dozens of them, then hundreds, laid out in geometric patterns across whole continents, structures that no one in her world knew how to raise and no one could say who had. And then it showed all of it being buried, page after page of a great flood that was not made of water but of earth, a rolling wave of mud and clay sweeping across the old cities and swallowing them to the rooftops, to the upper windows, to the very tips of their spires, until nothing was left on the surface but the highest points still breaking through, like the fingertips of something enormous reaching up for air. There is a name for what Delphia was looking at that night, though she herself never learned it. The people who study this now call it the Old World, or the Mud Flood, or by the name of the Empire that the old maps keep showing and the history books have somehow completely forgotten. An empire that once covered the entire globe, that built in stone and iron on a scale we could not come close to matching today, that had power and light and a working science we would now call impossible, and that was wiped off the face of the earth. It was not conquered, and it did not simply fall. It was erased, deliberately and methodically, and then it was buried under a layer of mud that geologists patiently explain away one single site at a time, and never, ever all at once. Because all at once it would look like exactly what it is. You do not have to take a granny woman's word for any of this. Look at your own city. Look at the old buildings, the courthouses and the capitals and the grand train stations, supposedly thrown up by frontier pioneers who could barely feed themselves through a winter, structures we honestly could not reproduce today with all of our machines. Look at how many of them have a bottom floor that sits half underground, windows that begin below the level of the sidewalk, doorways buried up to the lintel, entire first stories that everyone now calls the basement, but that were plainly built to stand in open daylight. Ask yourself what put the ground up over those windows. Ask yourself why the same thing happened to nearly every old building on the planet at roughly the same moment in history, and why no schoolbook you were ever handed spends even a single page on the largest earth-moving event in the memory of the human race. And then ask yourself where all of that mud actually came from, and what exactly it buried, and whether every last thing underneath it was empty and dead when it went down. The book showed more than drowning cities. It showed the star forts, and once you have truly seen them, you can never quite stop seeing them. Perfect geometric stars of stone and packed earth, points radiating outward in flawless symmetry, thousands of them scattered across every continent on the map, sitting in places that had supposedly never had the mathematics or the machinery or the sheer manpower to raise them. The official story is that they were military fortifications, cleverly designed to deflect cannon fire, thrown up by ordinary armies over the last few centuries. But the official story never quite explains why they turn up in the deepest jungles and the emptiest deserts and the frozen north where no army ever marched, why they share one single design across cultures that supposedly never spoke a word to one another, or why so many of them are found half swallowed by the ground, their lower points sunk down into the earth in exactly the same way as the old buildings with their windows below the street. And in the margins of those drowning cities, standing among the towers, the artist had drawn figures to scale, and the scale was either wrong or it was right, and everything we have ever been taught is wrong. They were enormous. The people of the old world, if that book told the truth, were giants, twice the height of a man and more, which happens to be a thing you can find quietly buried in the record of nearly every culture on Earth, in the mounds full of oversized human bones that were dug up all across America through the 1800s and shipped back east to great institutions that lost them, misplaced them, quietly declared them the bones of large elk, and then never let the public lay eyes on them again. The old world was built by hands far larger than ours, and it was buried, and its bones were confiscated, and its star forts were handed off to armies that could not possibly have built them, and its cities were relabeled ancient and mysterious, so that no one would ever ask the one question that unravels the whole thing. Not who built it, when, because the honest answer is not thousands of years ago. In the long reach of history, the answer is very nearly yesterday. So recently that women in the hills of Arkansas were still standing watch over the graves of it within living memory. This is what Delphia finally understood, sitting up alone with a book she could not read in a language nobody in her hollow had ever spoken. The Ozarks were not simply a range of hills with caves running under them. The Ozarks were a graveyard. The oldest mountains in America were the mounded-over ruin of something out of the old world, and the caves her people had always feared were not caves at all. They were rooms. The blind underground rivers were running through streets, and the wells, the plain, innocent, hand-dug wells that every single family needed just to stay alive, were boreholes punched down blind and at random into the ceiling of a buried civilization, and every so often, through nothing but pure bad luck, one of them went deep enough to break clean through. That is why the breakthroughs traced a pattern across the map. They were never following the geology. They were following the grid of a buried city. The streets and the foundations and the great walls of the old world laid out beneath the Ozarks in long lines that the mountains standing on top of them knew absolutely nothing about. And that is why the granny women, who had never in their lives read a single book about any of it, carried a rule so precise and so absolute. Their tradition was older than the erasure itself. They were not superstitious mountain women guessing wildly at a danger they did not understand. They were the last standing shift of a watch that had been set before the mud ever came down, the final keepers of a single instruction that had survived the actual end of the world by being whispered from one mouth to one ear for 1,000 years and more. Do not dig down to the old floor, and if you break through it by mistake, seal it again before dark, because the mud did not come down to bury an empty city. The sealing was never simple, and this is the part that survived only in fragments, because it was the part the granny women guarded most jealously, and the part the men who took Delphia's pages most wanted, gone for good. A seam could not just be shoveled full of dirt. Dirt settles, dirt washes out, dirt gives way, and the thing below could work its way slowly up through years of it the way a root finds its way through a crack in stone. The seam had to be closed with weight, and with fire, and with word, in that exact order, and all of it before the sun went down on the same day it had been opened. Weight went first, stone and iron sunk down onto the fitted floor to hold it. Then fire, or the thing that stood in for fire, quicklime poured down the shaft in quantity, the same lime they used to cover the dead in a plague year, because whatever the thing below actually was, it could not abide the burning cold of the lime laid over the burning cold of its own body. And then, last of all, the word, spoken aloud by the granny woman standing at the wellhead as the final load went down, a string of sounds that Delphia wrote out as best she could by how they sounded and that her granddaughter could never afterward reproduce. Older than English, older than the old country, a password left over from the watch that was set on the day the world was drowned. Say it wrong, or skip it entirely, or run out of daylight before you reach it, and the seal would not take. And a seal that did not take was far worse than no seal at all, because a failed seal told the thing below that someone up here knew it was there, and was afraid of it, and had tried to shut the door on it, and failed. Here is the part Delphia wrote in the largest hand of all, pressing down so hard the pencil tore straight through the paper, according to the one person who read those pages and lived to describe them. The old world was not merely buried, it was buried with something still sealed alive inside it. Whether the thing under the stone was the reason the old world fell, or a weapon that world had made and then could not unmake, or a prisoner that empire had locked away and then arranged its own burial specifically to keep locked away forever, Delphia never claimed to know. What she knew was what the seams told her, and what Elias Combe had felt in the cold, and what every last account across a full century all agreed upon. It is alive. It is patient beyond any human idea of patience. It has been pressing very slowly up against the underside of the world for as long as there have been people up here to hold it down, and the wells are the weak points. The wells are the places where the lid has worn the thinnest. Most of the time the rule held. A man broke through, the granny women were sent for at a dead run, the seam was weighted and burned and blessed and struck from every memory, and the lid stayed shut for another generation, but not always. Delphia recorded one particular failure, and it is the reason there is a stretch of country in the deep Ozarks where, to this very day, nobody will build and nobody will farm, and the maps simply show an empty patch of green with no road running through it. Sometime in the 1880s, in a hollow she would only ever name by an old word that no longer appears on any map, a family dug a well and struck the floor and then did the single thing you must never, ever do. They kept it. The black water was warm, and it never once froze over in the hardest winter, and it never ran dry through the worst drought anyone could remember, and to them it seemed less like a curse and more like a blessing straight from heaven. They drew from it for 3 years, and Delphia wrote that over the course of those 3 years the whole hollow changed around them. The animals went first, every deer and every bird, and finally even the insects, until the woods around that cabin fell into a silence that woods are simply never supposed to hold. Then the family themselves stopped coming down to town. When the neighbours at last went up to check on them, near the end of that 3rd year, they found the cabin standing wide open and empty and clean. No sign of any struggle, no bodies, nothing taken, nothing broken. And they found the well uncovered, and the water standing in it no longer black but clear, clear all the way down past any depth that a well has a right to reach, clear down to a faint grey light that moved slowly far below. And every man who leaned out over that mouth and looked came away agreeing on one single thing that none of them could ever quite force into words. Something down there had looked back up at them, and it had been glad they filled that well with everything they could lay their hands on, stone and timber, and 2 full wagon loads of quicklime, and then finally they brought down the whole hillside on top of it with black powder and walked away and told their own children never once to go back. It is still down there. Whatever came up to the clear water and was glad is still down there, underneath a collapsed hill in a hollow with no name left to it, and the real reason nobody farms that empty green patch on the map is that the people who live in the country around it have kept, without any of them knowing why, the very last instruction of a granny woman who died more than 100 years ago. Leave it be. Do not dig. Do not draw water. Do not. Whatever else you do, give it away back up. That nameless hollow is not the only blank spot either. Once you know to look for them, the map of the old Ozark country turns out to be full of them. Long stretches of good bottomland that no one has ever once put a plough to. Roads that bend hard for no reason a driver can see. Running a full mile out of their way to go around a patch of woods that looks no different at all from the woods on either side of it. Whole townships that were surveyed and platted and then quietly abandoned, the plats left folded in a courthouse drawer, the streets that were meant to fill them never built. The official reasons given are always perfectly ordinary. Poor drainage, a tangled title, a stubborn family that simply would not sell. But the granny women knew the real reason, and they handed it down not as a story but as a set of coordinates dressed up as superstition, a map of every place where the floor had gone thin and the lid had been set and must never, under any circumstances, be disturbed again. You have driven past these places. You have felt the small, quiet wrongness of them without ever knowing why, the way an animal feels it in the hair along its spine, and you have driven on. The animals were smarter than you. The animals left first. Delphia Rankin died in 1938, or in 1939. The records cannot agree, which is a fitting kind of end for a woman the records barely admit ever existed. She was nearly 80 years old. And in the last years of her life, she did the thing her entire tradition had forbidden for 1,000 years and wrote all of it down, the rule and the incidents and the map of the breakthroughs and the whole buried history out of the book. She could not read every last piece of it, so that when she was gone the watch would not have to end with her body. She gave the finished manuscript to a granddaughter. She told the girl to keep it safe, and to make copies of it, and to get it out into the world by any means she could, because the drilling was only ever going to get worse, and the lids were only ever going to get thinner, and someday soon somebody was going to punch a hole straight down into the old floor with a machine that did not stop for any granny woman's rule. The manuscript disappeared within a year of her death. The granddaughter's own account, which is very nearly all we have left, says that men came. She was never sure exactly who they were. They had the look of officials, county or state or something higher up than either, and they carried papers, and they asked, very politely, about the writings of the late woman Delphia Rankin, and when the family told them there were no such writings, the men came back a second time, and after that second visit there were no more questions asked by anyone. The pages were simply gone. What survives today is only what the granddaughter could hold in her own memory, and later tell to the few people who were willing to believe her, and it is a fraction of what Delphia actually knew, a fraction of a fraction, the bare outline of a warning stripped of every detail that would let a person act on it. the exact depth, the words of the ceiling, the location of every last well that was filled and then struck from the survey. All of it went out the door with those men, into whatever vault it is that holds the things we are not permitted to remember, and it has never once come back out. Which brings us, finally, to right now. Because the machines that Delphia Rankin was so afraid of arrived on schedule, exactly as she said they would. We drill now to depths her diggers could not have made themselves imagine. We punch boreholes miles down into the ground in search of water and oil and gas. We crack the deep rock wide open with raw pressure and hard chemicals, and we call the whole business progress. And we do all of it without a single old woman standing anywhere nearby to tell us the moment we have reached the floor. Every year the wells go a little deeper. Every year the lid wears a little thinner. And every so often, out of a drill site or a mine or a borehole somewhere down in the old Ozark country, comes a story that gets printed once in a small local paper and then is never, ever followed up on. A crew that hit a void that had no business being there. A drill bit that came back up to the surface sheared off clean. A shaft that had to be abandoned and capped and quietly left off the record for reasons the company involved will not discuss with anyone. You may have heard the loudest version of this without ever knowing what it was. In 1970, at a deep drilling project in the far rock of the old Soviet Union, a borehole passed 12 full kilometers down into the earth, and the engineers reported temperatures and open cavities that their own models swore could not exist down there, and then the entire project was abruptly shut down, and the deepest hole that human beings have ever made was welded shut and abandoned to the weeds. The story that circulated afterward, dismissed everywhere as a hoax, was that the crew had lowered a microphone down into the deep and recorded sound coming back up. Here at home the incidents are smaller and quieter and far easier to bury. A water district down in the Ozark foothills that drilled a new municipal well in the 1990s struck a void at an impossible depth, lost a whole string of pipe down into it, then sealed the site and drilled a fresh one 2 miles away without ever once explaining the first. A gas exploration crew that walked off a leased tract overnight and paid the penalty rather than finish the job, and would not say why, and whose foreman, when a local reporter finally tracked him down years later, said only that they had brought up water where there should not have been any water, warm water, black water, and that one of his men had stared down into the sample a beat too long and would not agree to work underground ever again. And here is the detail that ought to keep you awake tonight. Every last one of these modern incidents was handled by people who had never heard of Delphia Rankin, never heard the first word about a granny woman's rule, never had the faintest idea that there was a pattern for them to be a part of. The water district engineer sealing off his impossible void, the gas foreman quietly walking away from his lease, the Soviet crew welding the deepest hole on Earth shut and abandoning it to the weeds. Not one of them was keeping any old covenant. They were simply reacting, the exact way any sane human being reacts when the solid ground suddenly opens onto something that it should not, by getting away from it fast and covering it back over and never speaking of it again. Which means the instinct itself did not die out with the last of the granny women. It only lost its memory. The knowledge of why is gone, lifted out of a frightened granddaughter's hands by men with papers, but the raw animal understanding that some depths have to be sealed and never spoken of again is still down inside all of us, still surfacing every single time a drill pushes a little too far, still doing quietly and blindly the very same work those women once did on purpose and out in the open. The watch was never truly disbanded at all. It was only made to forget that it was still standing guard. None of these ever make the national news. None of them are ever laid side by side and connected to each other. Each one stays a small local mystery, explained away or simply left to be forgotten, a single site handled all alone in the dark, and that is not luck and it is not coincidence. That is the method. That is precisely how you bury an old world one building at a time, so that no living person ever gets to stand back and see the whole flood at once. And it is exactly how you bury a warning one granny woman at a time, until the very last keeper of the watch is an old woman in a hollow with a manuscript that vanishes the same year she dies, and the only shovel left anywhere is a voice coming out of a screen, telling you the one thing they spent 100 years making certain you would never get to hear. The thing at the bottom of the old wells was never a story the granny women told to frighten children away from dangerous holes in the ground. That is what we were meant to believe. That is the cover, in exactly the same way that every buried truth gets handed a harmless little cover to wear. The granny women were not warning children, they were warning us. They were the last fading edge of a knowledge that understood, completely and precisely, what the mud had come down to bury, and what is still alive underneath it, and just how thin the floor between us and it has finally worn. And now the last of them are gone into the ground themselves, and the record has gone down with them, and the drills go a little further every single year, chasing the warm black water that never runs dry, down toward the fitted stone, and the cold that rises up to meet you, and the thing on the far side of it that has been waiting and pressing, and is patient in a way that only something with all the time in the world can ever be patient. So the next time you pass those old stone-lined wells behind an abandoned farmhouse, capped over and forgotten and grown over with vine, understand what you are standing in front of. You are looking at a door that somebody, once, knew to keep shut, and understand why the women who kept those doors have been erased so thoroughly that you had to hear about them from a faceless voice on the internet instead of from a history book. People do not get erased like that for keeping harmless secrets. The least any of us can do now is not let it get buried a second time. If any part of this reached something real in you, subscribe, because this channel is a shovel, and every video digs one more piece of the old world back up into the daylight before they can shovel the mud over it again. There is so much more still down there. The star forts, the mud that came down over your own city, the reason the oldest maps keep showing an empire the books all swear never existed. The video on your screen goes down into it. Click it before the ground closes over the hole, and I will meet you at the bottom.